Good evening, Mr. Ferris, or that one teacher here, and I'm going to be perfectly honest, intros are hard, so I'm just going to kind of skip the intro and go right into this. So, in one of my classes, we've been talking about hearing God's voice and how God speaks and the challenges behind that. And as I've been reflecting on this, there's a couple things that have stood out to me, so I really felt like sharing those today. So I'm just going to get right into it. So, obviously, hearing from God is a challenge, something that's not very easy. If it was, we would not really need to think about it. We would just do the right things and do it. But like with most things, with being a follower of God and the Bible, it takes some time. It takes a challenge. So I personally think one of the first things that makes hearing from God so difficult is human beings actually have the ability to tell God no. And we're one of the few beings that can actually do that, which is a terrible and amazing ability, mostly terrible. And here's an example of that. Matthew 16:22, Jesus has just got done explaining for the umpteenth time that he is going to die. And in Matthew 16:22, it says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. The thing is about being a human being is we have the ability to choose whether we're going to follow God or whether we're not going to follow God. I think this is exemplified most in Revelation chapter 3 verse 20, which reads, Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. The thing is, we get this picture of Jesus actually being at the door of our heart, not kicking that door down, meaning that we have the ability as people to welcome Jesus in and to hear what he has to say or to lock him out. When that comes to hearing from God, if we are going to take that time in our prayer life and actually attempt to hear from God, well, the first thing we have to do is open ourselves up to that possibility. We need to be willing to put forth the work and ultimately convince or tell ourselves and God, I am willing to hear from God. I am willing to hear from you. If we don't, or if we don't come to that mindset, it's not going to work. Second thing I want to point out, excuse me, is that we can talk ourselves into or out of almost anything, virtually anything. Take 2 Samuel 12, verse 8, for instance. So in this scripture, Nathan is criticizing David, basically telling him that God has given you everything you could possibly want, but you've talked yourself into this mindset that you need even more. And the scripture reads, I gave you your master's house to you. I gave you I gave you your master's house, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah, and if that had been too little, I would have given you even more. David is a very interesting person to discuss when it comes to this because David quite literally had everything so many people think if I had that I would be satisfied. David had it. He had everything. He was wealthy. He was arguably the most powerful person on earth, or at least one of the most powerful people on earth. But he just got inside his own head and told himself he needed more. Now, how does that relate to hearing from God? If we don't think or don't want to hear from God, we can get that in our heads that either we don't want it to happen or that it's just not going to happen. We can so get in our own heads about that. And also, that can also mean, too, and that's going to lead me into our third point, is we can even convince ourselves that we shouldn't, for some reason, hear from God or we don't deserve to hear from God. That's just simply not the case. That leads me to my third point. Psalm 36, verse 5 reads, Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens and your faithfulness to the skies. The thing is, when it comes to God speaking to us, it's something He wants to do. Now, I don't mean that He's going to do that every second of every day to everybody all the time. So if you're not hearing from God, then you must be doing something wrong. But the thing is, if we do steps 1 and 2, so we go before God and we don't tell Him no. We open ourselves up and we say, God, I'm willing to hear what you have to say if you have something to say to me. And we don't talk ourselves out of it. If we convince ourselves that we are somehow not worthy to hear from God, or that God only speaks to certain people like the spiritual elite, we've misunderstood. And I would go as far as to say, if we need to ask God if He loves us, or if we are worthy of His love, and by extension, worthy of hearing from God, not only is the answer to that question, of course we are, but we fundamentally misunderstood who Jesus is and why He came. I'm going to say that one more time. If we need to ask Jesus if he still loves us and if he's still willing to speak with us, we have fundamentally misunderstood who Jesus is and what Jesus came to earth to do. Now, it's not to say, are we worthy? Because we're not. No human being on their own is worthy. We know that. But the thing is, Jesus' death and resurrection, and not only that, but his time on earth, was solely because he loves us. One could even argue that all of this, even creation itself, is because he loves us. He gave us a planet to live on because he loves us. He created humanity first and foremost in that perfect unity with God before the fall because he loves us. So no, legally speaking, we are not worthy to hear from God, but because of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, every one of us can hear from God. And if you think, I can't hear from God or God won't want to speak to me because I'm not worthy, that is the enemy speaking to you and you need to drown that out. So quick summary. Human beings have the ability to tell God no. So if you tell God you don't want to hear from him, you're not going to. We can get in our own heads and talk ourselves out of anything. So if we don't want to put forth that time and that effort or have that little bit of quiet time after our prayer to hear from God, if you convince yourself you don't want to do it, let's just be honest, we probably won't. I struggle with that too. And number 3, hearing from God has nothing to do with our spiritual worth or our status compared to others, because nobody is worthy. But because of Christ's death, everybody is worthy. You guys are all awesome. I hope this video spoke to at least someone out there, and I hope you guys have a great night. Thank you so much for listening.